The Whistler in the Hollow. My older sister, Mara, and my younger cousins, Eli and Noah, were left alone at my grandfather's cabin deep in the Appalachian woods. The adults had driven into town for a late-night gathering, leaving us in charge for the evening. Bored and restless, we decided to sneak out to Blackwater Hollow, a murky, secluded pond surrounded by dense forest and jagged rock formations. The trail to the hollow was narrow, flanked by gnarled trees that seemed to lean in as we passed. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine, and the only sounds were the distant hoots of owls and the rustling of unseen creatures in the underbrush. As we neared the pond, Eli, always the troublemaker, started telling us about a local legend. "You ever hear of the Whistler?" he asked, grinning. "They say if you stand at the edge of the hollow at midnight facing the woods and whisper, 'Come closer,' 3 times, it'll answer you." Mara rolled her eyes, but Noah looked uneasy. I, however, wasn't about to let Eli think he could scare me. Determined to prove him wrong, I climbed onto a moss-covered boulder, my back to the shadowy tree line, and whispered the words, "Come closer, come closer, come closer." The moment the third whisper left my lips, a sound cut through the silence, a low, wet whistle like air being forced through a rotten reed. My blood turned to ice. The whistle wasn't human, it was wrong, unnatural, as if something had learned to mimic the sound but didn't quite get it right. We spun toward the trees, scanning the darkness. The woods here weren't thick enough to hide anything large, just skeletal pines and jagged rocks leading up to a steep ridge. Then we saw it. Atop the ridge stood a figure, tall, too tall, its limbs stretched like pulled taffy. Its skin was the color of old bruises, mottled and peeling, and its head lolled to one side as if its neck had been broken long ago. But its eyes, they were black pits, glistening like oil in the moonlight. It tilted its head, then, with a horrible jerking motion, began to descend the ridge, not climbing, slithering. Its limbs bent at impossible angles, fingers digging into the rock like claws as it skittered downward, its gaze locked onto us. We ran. The forest erupted with movement. Twigs snapped, leaves crunched, but the worst part was the whistling, now coming from everywhere at once, echoing between the trees. Then, the footsteps. Not just ours. Something was keeping pace, darting just out of sight. I risked a glance. Back and saw a deer, no, not a deer, its body too thin, its mouth stretched too wide, its eyes hollow and knowing. "Don't look it in the eyes." The warning rang in my head. My grandfather had told me stories. Some things hunt with their gaze. We burst into the cabin, slamming the door and locking it behind us. Panting, we crouched in the living room, listening. For a moment, there was nothing, then tap, tap, tap. The sound came from the window. The curtains were drawn, but through the fabric, 2 dark shapes pressed against the glass. Eyes, watching, waiting. Then, silence. We barely had time to breathe before a deafening thud shook the roof. Something heavy was up there, moving in slow, deliberate steps. The banging grew louder, more frantic, like fists pounding against the shingles. We huddled together, covering our heads, as the noise reached a terrifying crescendo. And then, nothing. I don't remember passing out. I only woke hours later, sprawled on the floor with Mara, Eli, and Noah beside me. The cabin was eerily still. Outside, the first light of dawn crept over the trees. I stepped onto the porch, my breath fogging in the cold air. The ground was muddy from last night's rain, and there, leading away from the cabin, were footprints. Bare feet, too large to be human, with long claw-like toes. They disappeared into the trees. Even now I still go back to Blackwater Hollow. Not at night, never at night, but in the daylight, when the shadows stay where they belong. Some say the Whistler only hunts those who call it. Others say it's always watching, waiting for another invitation. All I know is this: if you ever hear a whistle in the hollow, run.